You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 343 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. On today's show, I'm talking about another coup attempt in Venezuela for the self-proclaimed president, backed by the United States, Juan Guaido, trying to overthrow the elected leader of Venezuela, Nicolas Maduro. I'm also going to talk about the impact of U.S. sanctions against Venezuela on the people of Venezuela. I'm going to talk about global military spending and what a huge chunk of it is done by the U.S. and our allies. And then the impact of the U.S. sanctions against Iran on the U.S. in the directions pushing the Iranians in. The best thing you could do for the show is to take a couple minutes to either recommend it to somebody you think will like it, or just post it up on some social media site. The best place to find the show online is at the Libertarian Institute, where the show and my daily news roundup are featured on the right-hand column of that homepage. And then if you want, you donate to the show at patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. So something that I think is going to get tied into the Russiagate thing is Rod Rosenstein resigning as Deputy Attorney General. You know, he ends up in an important role because Sessions recuses himself on the decision whether or not to appoint a special prosecutor. And I guess Rosenstein goes ahead and appoints Mueller and gets this whole thing kind of going. And so at times, Rosenstein was really in the crosshairs of Donald Trump, being upset that, you know, as we know from the Mueller report, you know, Trump felt like this was going to ruin his presidency. And in, you know, a lot of ways, and I'm sure I'm going to talk about this on future shows, and I've talked about plenty on past shows, it really did impact what Trump was, you know, able to do in some of the foreign policy measures he wanted. Because he wants to withdraw troops from Syria, and everybody goes, oh my God, Russia would win. And this is clearly another sign that, you know, Trump is owned by Vladimir Putin. And so it limits his range of abilities. Now, he should have done it anyway. And if he did it right, he could have thrown it in the faces of everybody like John Brennan, who was trying to make too big of a deal about it. But, you know, we're kind of stuck with Trump as president and not somebody like Ron Paul, who has a deep understanding of these wars and also is principally against them, where Donald Trump just said it. And I guess it got a good audience reaction, so he said it a couple more times. Jeffrey Rosen will replace Rod Rosenstein, or at least that's Trump's nomination. He's already, I think, a deputy treasury secretary, so I see no reason why he would, you know, struggle to get confirmed again for this new post. On the show in the past before, I've talked about these anti-BDS laws in the United States. Sometimes they're, you know, framed more in anti-Israel or anti-Jewish laws that say the government of a state is not going to contract with anybody, and at times I think even requiring the contractors, you know, so like a company contracts with the government, their employees all agree not to support boycott movements against Israel. And like I said, sometimes it's framed as an anti-Semitic prevention law or something like that. But really what it is it's an attempt to punish people who believe that the Israeli state is committing crimes against the Palestinian people. If you have any doubts that's happening, go back and listen to my second of the two-part interview I did with Scott Horton on WikiLeaks, where he talks about, you know, the crimes that WikiLeaks exposed to the Israeli state. And there's no doubt, there's plenty of reason why somebody, especially, you know, somebody who has personal ties to Palestinians or, you know, as themselves a refugee, would not want to do business with the Israeli state and benefit a state that's, you know, oppressing a group of people. Now, in Texas, there is a longtime speech pathologist, and she contracts with, I guess, you know, the public schools. And so they put this in her contract, and she says, I won't sign, and then sues them and says, hey, you know, this is restricting my First Amendment rights. I guess a federal judge, and, you know, this is early on, I'm sure it'll be appealed, ruled in favor of the speech pathologist and put in, I believe, an injunction on the law. So that would mean that, you know, she could go about her business, I'm sure, doing great work, for these children and also be able to, do something that she personally believes in. We also have a First Amendment case here with ICE where they intentionally target people for immigration law violations that were outspoken against ICE. And so, this was one of those cases where I was really bothered, and even some in the libertarian movement were kind of celebrating when some of these ICE arrests happened against people who were speaking out against ICE, saying, well, if you're in the country illegally, you probably shouldn't criticize the immigration enforcement. But at the same time, there's a lot of ICE that needs to be criticized. You see some of the raids that happen where they either arrest people, on court dates or mass arrest of people who sometimes are obviously Americans. They have IDs and are still end up getting arrested and crazy stuff like this, or just generally rounding up people that they think fits the general description of somebody who may be an illegal immigrant in a certain area. And, obviously that's just racial profiling and all the problems that policing that way causes. And so, the court ruled that no, you can't target people because they're speaking out against you. And it's just absolutely crazy. Look, if the IRS was targeting, churches or something that were speaking on political issues and technically them violating one of their nonprofit statuses and stuff like that, they would be absolutely outraged, especially if, that church was saying that, you shouldn't pay your taxes or, denouncing the IRS in some ways. They would go absolutely crazy, and obviously rightfully so. I mean, that would be extremely important for everybody to stand up and say absolutely not to something like that. Federal agencies, especially armed federal agencies, should not go after their critics. If there is a case like that, recommending that to like another kind of armed agency or the FBI, you would think would be the way to go if you actually had like an honest police state here. But, you have the dishonest kind that we're stuck with. Anyways, we have a Bill of Rights, and sometimes judges try to enforce it. And here are two cases where we have that. These stories are important. It's especially important to, talk about to the libertarian and right-wing types who really believe in, the Bill of Rights and the Constitution and hold it as the supreme law of the land. I read here that the U.S. deployment of troops to Australia is going to be 2,500, which is a massive number. It's like a whole battalion of Marines or something like that. And then they have a bunch of, pretty sophisticated military aircraft going with them. That's one important thing that I'm going to try to do more often, is not just talk about the deployment of U.S. troops on training missions, but also the equipment going with them. Because it sounds like one thing to send 1,000 troops to Poland to be, dozens or a few hundred miles away from the border with Russia there. But it's another thing to realize that those men are going with tanks and Humvees and different, assault rifles, sniper rifles, and, possibly all the way up to tanks, armored personnel carriers, aircraft, helicopters, attack helicopters, attack aircraft. All this stuff ends up going with the troops. And so from, that perspective, it seems like a much more substantial military deployment. And that's what we have going on here in Australia with, all the troops plus a whole bunch of equipment. No talk all about how much this is going to cost the U.S. taxpayers. Well, one of the reasons why there's never any talk about that is global military spending in 2018 was $1.82 trillion. And so I guess in one sense, we should look at this as Americans and say, while it's really bad in the United States, it is a global thing that, all of our leaders are enriching their friends by subsidizing their weapons makers industries and just putting weapons in the hands of people that they pay to go out and kill other people. And then it's just being a bad deal for the rest of us, right? But, looking at the numbers, 53% of all that defense spending is by NATO. So this idea that in any way the U.S. should be, or NATO is under any kind of threat. I mean, I talked about it a couple episodes ago. You had a CNN article with the headline that Russia is carrying out military operations on NATO's doorstep. And actually what's happened, of course, is that NATO's doorstep has moved right up to the border with Russia. But when you realize that 53% of all military spending is by NATO countries, you would think you would have to scratch your heads and think that, well, there's no way the rest of the world combined could be a threat to us, much less Russia, which doesn't even come in the top 5 in military spending anymore. now in 6th place. That 53% on military spending doesn't include strong U.S. allies that are NATO. This would be Saudi Arabia, Israel, the Emirates, the Qataris, the Bahrainians, who all spend a ton of money on weapons. Not to mention Egypt, another major weapons spender, the Iraqi government, which is kind of loosely allied with the U.S. at this point. But at the same time, these are all governments that spend a large amount of money that are also allied with the United States. And so when you total it all up and you look at, the U.S. and all of our NATO allies and then different satellite states spend the vast majority of money in the world, and you don't even really have a coalition of all the other states piled together against the United States. I mean, Russia will apparently militarily stick up for Syria and Venezuela, but not necessarily for China, and China will stand up for North Korea, but not necessarily Russia or Syria. So, it's not like when you look at the numbers, it should be so clear that there is really no substantial threat against us. The only thing in the world that, poses any kind of thing and is a parity to the U.S. power at all is the nuclear arsenals of Russia, China, and I guess you could really throw Israel in there. But other than that, I mean, militarily, we're strong. We're not threatened. The world is not stacked against us. Now, in some good news, Donald Trump has apparently directed the White House, whatever the hell that actually ends up meaning, to look into doing some arms control talks with Russia and China. And so this would be big because I do think if you're going to have new arms control agreements, including China, and that would probably help to get bigger commitments from Russia as China poses an interesting kind of strategic nuclear threat towards Russia. As I was pointing out, these two are not allied states against the United States. They're somewhat enemies of each other. And so China has short-range missiles with nukes on it and medium-range missiles with nukes on it, or at least those capabilities. And so, if Russia wants the same, they would technically be breaking some treaties with the United States. But those treaties with the United States serve a far different purpose when the U.S. is kind of pretty distance-wise far away from Russia, where Russia and China have a massive shared border. So maybe these three-way arms control talks, if they materialize, could be something really substantial. But as of now, it's just been this kind of directive from the Trump administration, which if it goes through his advisors and he doesn't personally take it up or assign it to somebody who would be really committed to it, we'll see more of what we have already had with John Bolton and Mike Pompeo directing the U.S. foreign policy, which is the destruction of these kind of agreements, not the creation of them. Yellow Vest protests continue 24th week, which, I mean, wow, this is a long time to be going on. This week's totals were apparently in the tens of thousands, the government reporting up over 20,000 people, with opposition putting the number in the, I think, 80s or 90s of tens of thousands. So either way, the French people are still unhappy with their government's policies. I'm sure part of it has to do with, the kind of imperialism of France and those efforts in, North Africa, Algeria, and Libya, where, by the way, airstrikes are being carried out on behalf of Haftar. And the U.S.-backed support is saying that they're not, American forces are not Haftar's government doing it. And so it's one of its, proxy supporters, which could be anybody from Russia to Egypt, Saudi Arabia, France. So there's a lot more to be found out of what's going on in Libya and this attack on Tripoli. But, France is playing a role there. All right, Venezuela and this regime change effort, we're still pretty fresh into it. And so I just want to go through the details as we could tell. My understanding was Juan Guaido was supposed to have a big rally on May 1st. And so I kind of expected maybe on Monday's show I would be talking about this story as, Guaido was able to turn out how many tens or hundreds of thousands of people, and the U.S. would start to, drum up another need for like a humanitarian convoy or some kind of softer, more diplomatic effort. But what you actually had here today is one of the leaders of the opposition, a guy by the name of Lopez, was freed from his home confinement. I'm not exactly sure. I have no idea on the details of that. I read that some supportive military came in to do that. I have no idea. Anyways, Lopez is freed. Him and Juan Guaido go outside of a military base and take a picture and post that the military has joined them in a coup attempt. In total pictures, it seems like the number of troops that are supportive of Guaido is in the dozens rather than, the hundreds or the thousands that you would actually need. Moon of Alabama has been doing some analysis on those photographs, saying that, from what you could tell, the uniforms, these are mostly low-ranking soldiers. And so it's not even like you have, generals standing out there. These are all just infantrymen. They also point out that they're not carrying the standard issue rifle of the Venezuelan military. Now, there's plenty of reasons this could happen. It doesn't mean that the U.S. gave them the rifles that they're holding, but they are, I think, M4s that these soldiers are holding, and not the, I think, Russian-made rifles that the Venezuelans military typically standard issues. Now, these protests do turn out, and there is some military there. There's a video that's apparently pretty gruesome. I decided myself not to watch it, of a Venezuelan government military vehicle running down some opposition protesters, appearing to be civilians, nobody actually firing anything. Although my assumption was that this would mean deaths. I just saw CNN reporting that 71 people have been injured in the conflict today, but not anybody dying. I would expect CNN to take any number of deaths they can and kind of, put those out there. I don't think they would be hesitant and, really looking to confirm what side a certain person who was killed was on. Maduro sends out a tweet to the masses and says, "Hey, if you support my government, come out," and has massive rallies around the presidential palace. And it's clear that this regime change effort has failed. There's no way that, these 30 troops are going to go shoot through I've heard the number was in the hundreds of thousands of people who went out, to form around the presidential palace and defend Maduro. I have no idea what the actual numbers of the rally are, but it was made clear that this coup attempt had failed. Lopez ends up in the Chilean embassy. About 25 other defecting soldiers end up, I believe, in the Brazilian embassy. And both of those, governments, I guess, would be more supportive of the opposition. I know Brazil is part of the Lima group, which is kind of the group of these Western nations, Canada, the United States, obviously Peru, Colombia, Brazil, and I think there's like 13 in total, who have all been kind of working on this regime change effort here in backing Guaido. I have no idea about the whereabouts of Guaido at this time. I, saw reports that he had been arrested. I saw reports that he had fled the country. This is something that we will find out in the days to come here. So yeah, as of recording this show, it seems this coup attempt has fizzled. Now, who knows, maybe tonight or in the coming days, we're going to see a measure escalation by the United States to try to somehow put Maduro or Guaido in power and take out Maduro, or maybe they back another kind of figure at this point, as it seems like a second coup attempt by Maduro or Guaido would be enough to, kind of proclaim that this guy obviously just doesn't have the support to get it done. But they have proclaimed him to be president. Now, by far, the most interesting reaction to all this has been by our fantastic national security advisor, John Bolton, who said that this isn't a coup attempt because Juan Guaido is already the president that we recognize in Venezuela. Now, the funny thing is it's obviously a coup attempt because the Venezuelan people don't recognize Juan Guaido as their president. In fact, only a small percentage of them even knew who Juan Guaido was when John Bolton proclaimed him to be president. Now, obviously, there's room to criticize the Maduro government here. Running down a bunch of protesters in a military vehicle is absolutely unacceptable and disgusting, and probably injured severely a lot of people if it didn't end up killing a few. However, that is the government of Venezuela, and this just seems more evidence that Maduro has the popular support needed to hold on to, the throne there, and the U.S. needs to stop trying to overthrow him and take off these sanctions, because all they're doing is hurting the Venezuelan people. A study found that when looking at the numbers between 2017 and 2018, after the U.S. sanctions were put in place, the general mortality rate in Venezuela rose by about 40,000 deaths. Now, from my understanding, this is a time when the hyperinflation and, the going to the grocery store in the afternoon is a lot more expensive than in the morning. The currency does start to stabilize here at some point. And so you would maybe expect the general mortality to start to stabilize or go down. But you saw it go up. And of course, the U.S. Sanctions creates more instability for the economy as well. Now, the study does say that, it substantially contributed, U.S. sanctions, to the increase in general mortality. It didn't say that every single one was, or that, we could absolutely show how that happened. And that's the way things work in the real world. There's no 100% count that you're ever going to have of how many people die from U.S. sanctions. But here you have a study that's able to kind of point out like, hey, these are when the U.S. sanctions kick in. This is what you expect to happen. This is what actually happened. And, the contributing factors. And the U.S. is the world empire. We control the world banking system, the trade system. The U.S. is the petrodollar. That's what they trade oil in. And so if you have an oil state like Venezuela that gets, their oil company sanctioned like it had recently by the Trump administration, that's going to have a huge impact on the people. Or all the different ways the U.S. has been able to impact Venezuelan, policy and economic output has, led to more death for the Venezuelan peoples. And, what we can say now is strongly contributed to the death of 40,000. The U.S. has put sanctions on Venezuela's foreign minister. This I see as concerning because, as we've seen with Kim Jong-un attempting to hold these summits with Donald Trump, the sanctions prevent a lot of different kinds of transactions from being taking place. And so if you're sanctioned internationally, it's kind of hard to travel around the world, I would think. Be able to get hotels and, who ends up paying for your meals and all that's a huge deal. Mike Pompeo said that we are going to accelerate the plan to cut the Kabul embassy staff in half. Great to see if it happens. I want less Americans in Afghanistan, whether they're, working at the State Department or for the military, because in this sense, the State Department, I don't think are really diplomats, but rather people trying to enforce our regime change on the Afghani people. All right, so on these sanctions with Iran, there's 3 articles I'm going to link to in the show notes page. They ran in my news roundup today explaining how U.S. sanctions with Iran are pushing the two countries closer to war. One by, I think this is a Phil Giraldi article, but I may be misremembering there. Goes into how this is actually isolating the United States because, we're pushing countries like India and China, and we're saying that we're going to sanction you if you continue to buy oil from Iran. And it seems that they're going to need to continue to buy oil from Iran. And so, they're going to be less able to do business with the United States because of the sanctions. And then a very good one by Daniel Lazare in the American Conservative, explaining how the U.S. is now looking at sanctioning some of the Iranian nuclear trade. This is a civilian nuclear program trade, so nothing to do with nuclear weapons at all. But this would be something that may push Iran to abandon the nuclear agreement. Want to update this on Ukraine because last time on the show I had kind of said that, hey, some of the recent developments here seem like it's a rocky start for Vladimir Putin and Zelensky, the president-elect of Ukraine. But Zelensky did come out and say that he would be open to talks with Russia to try to end the crisis in the Donbass. I mean, that, it's just saying that you're open to talks isn't much, but at the same time, it isn't nothing. And, while you could see this relationship getting off to a rocky start, maybe extending that hand will be enough to get it moving in the right direction here. All right, that's where I wrap up the show for today. I'll be back on Friday, everyone. I'm sure more news on Venezuela. So I hope you guys are, subscribing to the show somewhere. That way you're not missing an episode, and then going and checking out Libertarian Institute, where you can find my news roundup and the show there on the homepage, and then click the share button. That way more people could see it and listen to it and hopefully change their mind about the war. So thanks, everyone.